now let me get to what I'm going to talk about. So this is the first sort of crowdsourced keynote that I've done in the sense of I talked to lots of our clients to try to figure out what to talk about, right? When we do Future of FinTech, I really know who's in the audience. It's kind of like, all right, we're going to talk about FinTech, right? It's kind of clear. This one I was a little bit more challenged with, so I talked to lots of our clients and said, hey, what would be interesting? Here's what I'm thinking about. I said, hey, I'm thinking about how companies grow. And so they said, yeah, that sounds good. And so what, kind of looked at, okay, well, what does that mean, right? And so I think one of the things that's interesting to us as we've grown at CB Insights is the number of people at organizations who drive growth has become pretty eclectic, right? And I'm not talking about sort of the core, right? Sales and marketing and product obviously are very important there, but looking at sort of more discontinuous, disruptive change, things that are a little bit outside of the core, there's a lot of people who are involved, right? And you can just see some of the titles here, right? It's innovation, partnerships, digital transformation, right? So, how do you talk about how companies grow when you have this sort of eclectic of a group of people? I think we have a unique vantage point here. In 2019, we'll have 1,000 clients, 70+% are large corporations. So you can see some of them here. And so we see, companies across sectors, across the globe, who all tackle growth in different ways. And so I think trying to pull out some of their challenges was something that we thought we could do. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about why seeking growth opportunities is so vital. This is going to be a bit of a rehash. How many of you have seen the sort of gradually then suddenly presentation before? Okay, all right, not as many of you as I thought, so this is good. So gradually then suddenly, this is sort of our view on sort of how disruption happens. The title is taken from this Ernest Hemingway passage in The Sun Also Rises, where he asks, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer is 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly, right? And so what we see is this happening in corporate life. Part of the reason is you can see the evidence of that here. This is the lifespan of an S&P 500 company over time. Back in the late 50s, it was 60+ years that you were in the index. Now it's getting into the teens and even going down further. So sort of what got you here won't get you there, and that's becoming clear. The sort of insurgent threat has magnified, right? So in dot-com boom 1 in 2000, it was a lot of money to launch a startup, to launch an insurgent. Because of technology, cloud and AWS and Microsoft Azure, et cetera, the cost of launching a startup is a lot lower. Of course, this doesn't mean the cost of scaling a startup has gotten lower, as you can see from some of the funding data that's out there, but it is becoming cheaper to launch an insurgent. And what's happening as a result of that is the landscapes around competition are changing, right? So, if you think about Mercedes and Lexus and BMW, that was sort of the old competitive set. Now it's, Uber, Tesla, Waymo. You have, Target and Walmart, going up against Amazon and Alibaba. I used to work at American Express. We used to think about Citi and Visa and MasterCard as our competitors. Now it's all these kind of newer cast of characters. And then, in the sort of telecom cable space, right, it was Comcast, Time Warner, Verizon. Now it's, Netflix, YouTube, et cetera. So the lines of competition change. Technology is sort of at the core of this, right? Largest companies by market cap over time. 2006, 2011, you see one tech company. 2016, tech ran the board. 2018, tech continues to run the board. This is probably dated from earlier in the fall, so Microsoft has actually done a remarkable job and has overtaken Apple, at least as of yesterday, I believe. With technology, what's happening is the adoption of technology has gotten faster and faster, right? And so if you can look here, look at the x-axis, 1900, look at the dashed orange line. The telephone took 105 years to get to 90% of penetration in US households. And then if you kind of go over on the x-axis to the right, you see the cell phone and internet essentially got to that same level of penetration in 15 years, right? So the adoption of technology has accelerated, and it continues to accelerate, right? And so here we see kind of some of the tech platforms that grew really quickly. Then Facebook came along, grew even faster. WhatsApp came along. But what's interesting now is that it's not just tech, right? This is fintech hypergrowth. So Alipay out of China has grown really quickly. If you actually look at Reliance Jio, which is a telecom or mobile provider in India, they actually got to 100 million users in, I think, 16 months, right? So the rate of growth of companies and platforms is one that we've not seen before. And if you look at the India example, Reliance Jio has sort of killed all of the other mobile operators in India, sort of caught them flat-footed, right? So I think there's a really interesting thing here going on where it's not just a tech thing anymore. The insurgents are global, right? This is Ant Financial, or the owner of Alipay, the 10th most valuable financial services company in the world. And then, we try not to talk about startups as the only insurgents, right? This is an example of Amazon. The Chase website is in the middle, and all of Amazon's offerings are kind of scattered throughout, right? That go after financial services. Amazon just acquired PillPack, so obviously have some ambitions in healthcare as well. So Insurgency is, big, well-heeled tech platforms as well. Nobody wants to be this quote, I'm sure. How many of you have used this in a presentation internally at some point? Everybody? Okay, yeah. If you're like in growth and you haven't used this quote, you're not doing your job. So this is the money quote. And then the other big thing is now you have, for those of you who are public, activists are actually sort of embracing this idea of not being technology forward and coming after companies, right? And so we've seen it in the case of P&G and other companies. Ford was an example where the CEO got pushed out because of kind of not getting with the technology quick enough. So given all this change, you have to adapt. So what's the playbook, right? So that was kind of, my initial thesis was, well, how do companies grow? And so I thought about it a little bit more, and sort of when we think about companies, we try to use a very simple kind of framework, right? If you look at a company, they have skill and they have will. Those companies that have neither, we tend to ignore, right? They don't tend to talk to us either, right? Because they're not thinking about it, right? And then everybody else, and out of 1,000 organizations, what we've really seen is that there isn't a playbook, right? And so I went back to all of our clients and said, hey, listen, I'm working on this Keynote, and it's actually not coming together. I don't have a simple way to bring it all down into a framework that everybody can use and go back to their organization, and that will be the thing that will teach them how to grow. And so they came back to me and said, hey, listen, CBI is really good about calling bullshit, so why don't you just do that? And so what we're going to do is how companies don't grow. And so just for kind of background, I used to run the innovation-funded American Express, so a lot of these are mistakes that I actually made myself. And so these are some learned from clients, some are my own challenges in the past. So I'm going to just jump right in. This is one of those keynotes where I worry I'm going to piss off at least 50% of you. So, so please don't take offense to anything. I think our goal really here is, can we challenge some of the orthodoxies that have kind of become a thing when we talk about growth? There is no playbook, I guess, is sort of the punchline ultimately. But I think challenging and pushing back on some of these dogmas is important. I used to do this. This is not true, right? So sadly, right? And so I'll give you the best example story. When we started CB Insights, I did well at American Express, had a good network, had vendors and partners there. And I left American Express and I called them and said, hey, I'm working on this thing, would love to chat. And nobody called me back, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest differences when you leave a big company, is that the brand, my business card, the logo on it carried a lot of the water for me, right? So it wasn't me that people cared about, they cared about that brand. And so I didn't actually, and people did work on spec and for free and told me all my ideas were good and said how smart I was. And when you get out in the market and you don't have that behind you, they don't even tell you your idea sucks, they just don't call you back, right? And so I think that's one of the big differences. So, these are our favorite punching bags. You obviously know this. This I call the conjoining hexagons of innovation. So if you have a business hexagon and a technology hexagon and a human context hexagon, you get innovation. This is another good one. Somebody can help me with that one. And I'll go through some of the quick ones, right? Office open floor plan, whiteboard paint, casual dress code, free meals, hire some Googlers. This one's interesting. I think, we spend a lot of time, and we get a lot of questions from corporations saying like, hey, what are the best practices on stage gating, right? And like, this is important, right? But like, there's no process that will make you grow, right? Like the process is helpful, but like, they're like, oh, we've got 7 stages. We're not sure if it should be 6 or 8. It's like, who the F cares? Like, why are we talking about this, right? Like, it just over-engineered. Like, just make a decision and let's move on, right? And so, like, and I did the same thing at American Express. We had, like, so many stage gate discussions, and it was just utterly pointless when I look back on it. All right, so we're going to talk about the network, right? I think this is one that, like, everybody's going out to Silicon Valley. We are investing in VCs as an LP to access innovation. I'll just get into it, right? And so, like, anybody know the Lake Wobegon effect, right? And, like, every corporation that we talk to says they have a superior network, right? And, like, it just can't be that everybody is above average. Like, that's not the way math works, right? So, and so I think one of the challenges here is, and people say the same things to us. They're like, yeah, we got to the Valley, we say, oh, who'd you meet with? Here's the dirty secret. You all are meeting with the same 15 VCs, okay? And, like, that's just, there's VCs who have very good programs to work with corporations, and they do what they're supposed to do, but you all are meeting with the same people, right? So, like, how do you have a better network? I think the other thing here is when we talk about VCs and the ecosystem, and they are very important partners. I don't want to say that they're not, but I think what we're mistaking here, and I did this again at American Express, is I didn't understand their business model, right? So let's just break it down really simply. The VC circle of life is getting money from limited partners and then investing that money. And that investment process looks something like that, right? They need to see the deal, they need to assess it, they need to win it, they need to nurture it, right? The thing that you don't see here, and the corporations are obviously involved, but the thing you don't see here is that you're not in this, right? Like this is their customer, right? And so I think it makes sense that they will, they should be nice to you. Everybody should be nice to everybody, right? I'm not saying that that's wrong, but, like, what we have to realize is there's no preferential access here, right? Like, they want their companies in as many big companies as possible, as a vendor, as a potential acquisition. They're not going to be like, hey, Fuat from Bose, hey, I'm going to give you a better deal on my portfolio company. Like, if you put in an offer today, you're going to get it for 20% less. Like, that doesn't happen, right? So, like, the network is great, but, like, I don't think there's a huge advantage that anybody has around the network, right? And there are a few, and we'll get into maybe some of those. Starting a corporate VC, right? So I'm going to just share some data with you. Corporate VC, as everybody knows, has dramatically climbed. Funding has gone, dramatically up. CVCs as a percentage of deals have grown as well. So corporates are becoming a more prominent part of the ecosystem. Corporate VCs also invest a great deal more. The number of first-time CVCs is climbing. And what's interesting, and I worked in an earlier incarnation of American Express Ventures, we used to only invest at the later stages, right? We'd follow on at the Series B stage when there was a lead partner. What's interesting in this go-around is CVCs are much more active at the seed stage, which is, I think, an interesting kind of appetite for risk that folks are taking. So why do CVCs invest? These are sort of the two big level, two high level buckets. It's strategic, it's financial. I'll argue that the financial side doesn't make sense. I think the strategic side does, right? So unicorns have also boomed. So this is the unicorn count over time. Unicorns, for those not familiar, private companies that are worth over $1 billion on paper. And you see there's 290 of these globally right now. So, big boom here, lots of corporate VCs. So how corporates should be getting into these companies? Only 3 CVCs have invested in a Series B or earlier of 3 or more unicorns, right? So, like, if you want financial returns, you have to get in early. And there's not a great track record here that CVCs are good stock pickers, right? So again, like, I think the strategic side makes sense, but the financial side, the data doesn't suggest that CVCs have been able to do it. And then just to put a kind of exclamation point on it, all the CVCs have big West Coast tech. They're big West Coast tech companies who are entrenched in the ecosystem. A lot of them have products and services they want to sell into these companies, right? So that's the CVC side. Let's just queue up some comments from Fred Wilson from our first Future of FinTech. He's got some interesting things to say.
Look, I hate corporate investing. I've gone on record as saying that. I think it's dumb. I think corporations should buy companies. investing in companies makes no sense, right? Like, don't waste your money being a minority investor in something you don't control. You're a corporation. Buy it. If you want the asset, buy it. If you don't want the asset, I mean, make a minority investment. What does that do? Makes you look smart to your boss?
I guess if I was going to channel, some of the folks who I've seen here today, I would think that, particularly in this space, a venture arm gets you some access, gets you
What though?
Gets you in the room so you can hear what they're working on to see if that's relevant. Although there's probably cheaper ways.
So if
to
you're
do
the
that.
entrepreneur, do you want them in the room?
Apparently, many do.
Well,
Based on the
because they either can't get money from anybody else,
Right.
or the corporations have paid a higher price than I would pay, right? So they do business with the devil. They're doing business with the devil.
All right. So for those of you unfamiliar with Fred, part of Union Square Ventures, early investor in Etsy and Twitter and Zynga, a unicorn hunter extraordinaire. Another kind of popular thing is to launch an accelerator. So I wanted to look at the data here. The number of deals by corporate accelerators have skyrocketed. We stripped out accelerator programs that don't give money or don't take equity stakes, right? There's a lot of in-kind sort of accelerator programs, incubators. We wanted people who are putting money in, so this is just focused on those. The number of actual accelerators has sharply gone up, right? And so what we wanted to do was, take 2016, it looks like sort of, we'll call that the new normal. So we wanted to look at that vintage of accelerators to see where do those folks stand today. And so there was 43 at that point. So what was the accelerator mortality rate? So how many of them 2 years later are still active? Any guesses? How many are still active? 75%? 50, okay. So let's break it down. 6 are actually more active, so 14% are more active. 10 have the same level of activity. I think we did sort of plus or minus 5% of deal activity as our threshold there. 1 was less active, and 60% are dead, right? And so it's a dramatic mortality rate just 2 years later, right? So I think this is, is telling. I think, this is where innovation, or this is where investing in the ecosystem is really important, right? Like getting the article in TechCrunch is not mission accomplished, right? That is one thing, right? Like you actually have to go out and meet people, and going to a few meetups is also not mission accomplished, right? If you want access to the best deal flow, it takes a while. And so make sure that your organization has the wherewithal and the stamina to try to invest in something like this, right? I think the other thing is that accelerators might not always be the right path, right? There's a bunch of people out there who will sell you an accelerator. So they, every nail is an accelerator hammer, right? It's a good business, right? There's a bunch of people who will sell you corporate VC as the solution. I think that goes back to this idea that there is no simple solution to growth. If there was, y'all wouldn't be in this room, right? That's just the reality. So blindly jump on every tech trend, right? So I think this is sort of, like a moth to light, right? Certain things, right? And so when we look at the data, right, like chatbots, this is media mentions from our search engine, blew up. Everybody was thinking about chatbots. We're already seeing those kind of cool off. Big data, anybody remember big data? Right, this is earnings call mentions, right? We're seeing that decline. I thought this was a brilliant tweet, so I'll just let you read it. So Matt's at Microsoft, really good, really appropriate, I think. We don't really work with startups, but sometimes we'll have friends who are startups, and our general advice is throw some AI in the deck. Just say you do AI. You will get better valuation, quicker time to close. It's all roses. Dilbert, of course, captures this beautifully. I'll let you read that. And we'll just go back to our friend Fred Wilson, who also has some choice words about blockchain.
I also think that a lot of these financial services companies, are, they're just like, oh shit, we got to get some of this blockchain. How do I get some of this blockchain?
Need some blockchain.
I need some blockchain. And so they're like,
Jones in. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, those numbers are astounding, right? Like literally all the money that went into this sector from 2010 through 2014 went in from angels and,
Right. Bankers wouldn't mention this.
Like, right.
Until
And then now it's all like, it's all the financial services companies are all in
Right.
now all of a sudden, right? It's like, honestly, it's time to get the fuck out for a while, right? When that happens, because that's like the dumb money showed up, right? It's like, oh, fuck, the dumb money showed up. Time to get out of here.
If you ever met Fred, he's like, we got him on a really good day. He's not usually like, he's much more reserved. Other things on how not to grow. I think this is one of these interesting things, right? Where innovation, everybody feels like they need to do it. They find somebody in the org who doesn't necessarily have like a path, and they give it to that person, right? So I think it's a challenge. The new senior title thing, right? So we're going to wanted to dig into some data here. So like the new title is the Chief Digital Officer, right? It's how many of you, any Chief Digital Officers in the room? Probably nobody wants to raise their hand. All right, sorry. So we looked at the S&P 500. Right now, 17% of them have a chief digital officer. Most of them hired in 2016, right? Like the vast majority are 2016 and later. 14% sit on the executive leadership team. Sorry, not 14% of the 17%, 14% overall, which is a good sign, right? Like they have a good seat at the table. Here's the breakdown of chief digital officers. So 17% across the S&P 500, telecom, financials, consumer discretionary, et cetera, down the list, kind of where are they most represented. And here's the performance since Jan 17 of companies without CDOs, companies with CDOs. This is not, so this is a correlation causation problem, and I'm gonna just alert you to that, right? So this is putting the performance of these companies on the backs of their CDOs is profoundly unfair, and that's not what we are doing. Although people are going to make that claim, and so I apologize to CDOs, right? But what this does highlight is that like hiring somebody in to be the digital gal or guy and be like, sprinkle that digital stuff all over the place, like that's not the way it works, right? So like we have to find ways of sort of integrating this into the fabric of who we are as organizations. Because there's going to be a new title, because what's going to end up happening is some poor person is going to their CEO is going to be like, hey, I saw this thing at CB Insights, and like, why do we have you, right? And like that's, that's unfortunate. This one's really interesting. So, that earlier slide, we showed all these different groups that now manage or are involved in growth, right? Which is great. There's a lot of people thinking about it, right? But like, it actually does create confusion, right? And I think we'll ask clients a lot, say, oh, you have a corporate venture team, you have partnerships, you have M&A, you have biz dev and partnerships, that does it for some group. How do they work together? And like, it's ad hoc at best, right? It's like, oh, well, we get together, we exchange notes, right? Like, it's a really interesting kind of thing. And then this is one of the biggest things, back to going to Silicon Valley, it's like we're going to bring learnings from the outside in, right? So like, it's a very laudable goal. So how do you do that, right? And so when you look at how does growth actually manage this process, right? Like, if you want a seat at the big kids table, right? You look at HR, sales, marketing, and finance, like they have systems of record, right? Like everything lives in one place, and they can all know what's going on with each other. And what does growth have? Right? Like that's the way most of us, and I did it at American Express, right? I had a list of payments companies that we tracked, told the team, hey, this company just got funded, update the spreadsheet, right? Like that was our system of record. Like that's absurd, right? So it creates duplication and confusion. And this is an example from somebody in this room who I will keep nameless. So they had a growth group, innovation, that was engaged with a startup, right? So you see that relationship. That same startup was working with IT strategy, right? And the way that innovation found out was through the startup, and the way that IT strategy found out was through the startup, and the way that innovation and IT strategy, they said, hey, we should probably be talking to each other. Like, what are we both trying to do? And the way they found out who each other was? Through the startup. Like, they couldn't even go to a single place and say, oh, Patty, you're working with this company. I'm Joe from this group. Like, literally, the only way to get to that other person at your organization who's working with the same person or the same startup was to go through the startup, right? Like that is a profound amount of dysfunction that we have to solve in growth organizations. So let's just keep going. I'm way over time. Two opposing challenges here, right? I think one is innovation growth-focused teams don't have metrics, right? And I think this is one that's interesting. We get the sense sometimes that those teams don't want metrics, right? Because like then you're gonna have to be accountable to it, right? But the negative of that is you don't have a metric of success, right? So then when the winds change, you can't say, people like to be consistent. Like there's sort of a psychological principle around this, right? So if you did what you said you would do and you'd agreed upon it, they might not they might have thought they set the bar too low, but at least you had a criteria for success. So, not having metrics is a problem. And then the other challenge is that sometimes when you have metrics, they're very short-term focused. So we did this state of innovation survey late last year, and these were the short-term measures that people generally measured things on. It was on revenue, projects completed, customer satisfaction, right? Like to have revenue means that you have to have done something that generated revenue very quickly. And so again, when you think about longer-term bets, it's hard to measure some of these things on these metrics. We have that photo booth outside, definitely take a picture there. Agile's my favorite one, right? So we talked, again, state of innovation, 51% of corporations prefer to build versus buy versus partner. It takes 60% of you more than a year, a quarter of you more than 2 years to launch a new product, right? So like it just takes a while. And we looked at hyper growth of tech platforms. Like the world is just going very quick. This is a very long time. We did a survey of corporate growth leaders on why your pilots fail. And so I'll just jump into a couple of those reasons here. These were the top 10 reasons, right? Not the right team, product without a business model, ignore customers, et cetera. Not the right team. I think one of the interesting one here, I should have probably put it first, was the appropriately lean team. So actually a bunch of you came back and said, we just overstaffed this thing. It was like a problem of riches, right? It was too many people. There wasn't sort of one throat to choke, right? It was just like, it was a lot of committees. Like it felt like a big company right from the get-go. Maintaining continuity during transitions. I think this is really important. Sean from Fidelity is going to talk a little bit about how they do this. Some good quotes by Larry Page and Jeff Bezos. Product without a business model, right? I think it was like the strategy for generating revenue wasn't there, or if it's going to take a while, you have to get the organization ready for that. And then, the potential to be a needle mover, which is important in large companies. Ignoring customers. The third one here I think is interesting is that some folks said that we thought our brand would give us license to enter this space, and when we actually went out in the market, people didn't think that our brand carried over there, right? But I think sometimes at big companies, and I know at American Express, we used to think this, like, oh, we're a trusted brand, everybody loves us, we can get into this space, and they'll just kind of take that association over with them. It doesn't work quite that way. It definitely helps, but it doesn't always work that way. Good old Steve Jobs quote, product took too long, just taking too much time, over-engineering it, kind of get it out there, maybe be embarrassed by it even. And then how do companies do when they buy? So this is one that I don't think anybody's ever done this analysis, was we looked at how long do founders stay post M&A. So we looked at the 100 largest VC-backed exits from 2009 to 2016, right? Within 6 months, over a third of founders leave, right? So if you're trying to bring kind of innovation from the outside in, and part of it maybe is, having these people who are builders and who have teams, right? If more than a third are leaving in 6 months, and then 45-ish% are leaving within 2 years, right? Like that's a problem, right? And so this is something that if you're going to do M&A, you have to think about how you're going to solve that. Noam, who's here tomorrow from Waze, which Google bought 5 years ago, he's still there. We're going to dig into a little bit of that with him. I'm going to close with this donkey. Anybody familiar with this parable or this paradox of Buridan's ass? Okay, so Jean Buridan was a French philosopher, and this paradox where you have a thirsty and starving donkey who is equidistant between a bale of hay and water, right? And so what does he do? He looks at the bale of hay, he looks at the water, looks at the bale of hay, looks at the water, and then dies of thirst and starvation, right? And so I think one of the things as we were building this conference was we want you to leave with a couple of ideas you're going to implement in your organization, right? So meet through networking, through the sessions, right? Don't be like Puridon's ass, okay? Like if you see an idea, it's, take it out of PowerPoint, go make it happen. I think that would be success for us. If there's anything we can do to make your experience here better, help you meet somebody, questions, if you disagree vehemently with anything I just said, please come find me or the team. But thanks again for coming, and we'll see you throughout the afternoon. Thanks.